Hey everybody, it's great to see you today. Welcome to Living Power, your online Bible study where we are walking through the Bible in a year. Today is November 15th and we are back in the book of Acts. We actually start with Acts 15 today, looking at the Jerusalem Council. This was a very important meeting. In fact, it was so critically important that this is the first recorded crisis of doctrine that we see in the Bible. It's amazing that this meeting actually took place 20 years after Jesus was resurrected and ascended back into heaven. So a lot of time has passed. There's a lot of water under the bridge, if you will. And Paul is, I guess he's on his second missionary journey. Peter has a very thriving ministry. James, the brother of Jesus, we're not sure when, but he at this point, he is serving as the leader of the church in Jerusalem. The mother church, if you will, is this in Jerusalem. And because of this crisis of doctrine that we've been talking about, the Judaizers on one hand say that you have to be circumcised to be saved. Paul on the other hand says, no, it's grace, it's a free gift, it's belief in Jesus. If you add to it, then you water down the gospel. It's not. So Paul decides that he and Barnabas are going to go back to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James and the others. They take a man named Titus with them, who is actually a Gentile that has not been circumcised. And they take him to settle this thing once and for all. It was a very, very important meeting. We're looking at about 49 AD, give or take a few years. And the Judaizers' position can be summarized in Acts 15, verse 1 as this: unless you are circumcised according to the law, you cannot be saved. So, mark that in your Bible. That was their position. And they simply weren't backing down. The reason Paul brought Titus was because this was the point in case right in front of them. He wanted to see what would happen. How would Peter and James and the others decide? They were either going to let them go back home and, just like they were with a blessing, or they were going to insist that Titus be circumcised as a member of the faith. So, what do you suppose happened? Now, as we walk with Paul, let's pretend for just a moment that we're with Paul. We're part of his delegation. So Barnabas is there, Titus is there, Paul is there, and you. Okay? And let's pretend that we're walking, we've been traveling by boat, and we walk into the meeting place in Jerusalem, and as usual, there are crowds of people. And we see Peter, and we see James, and maybe John is even there, and then there's a whole bunch more people, maybe 40 other people in this small little crowded room. There aren't any tables, there aren't any chairs. Maybe there's one table in the back, but mainly there are mats on the floor, and that's where people would be sitting. They see Paul, and as you enter with Paul, there's some grumbling, and you can just tell, you can feel it as you walk in the room, that they're grumbling about your delegation, and you start to feel a little bit uncomfortable. You realize you might have just walked into a hornet's nest, but you are going to stand strong with your friends, and you're going to see this through. The discourse begins, Peter and Paul talking, presenting their positions, but there are what Paul calls spies in the room. They're behind you, they're in the back of the room, and they try to push their way forward and make their point. They have hostile intent. They are trying to infiltrate the council. They are diluting the truth of the gospel, and they obviously didn't recognize Paul or your delegation as being commissioned by God, and they believe that they need to impose circumcision on this man Titus. However, you are tight-mouthed, you've buttoned your lip and you were just going to be quiet and wait and see what happens. Paul quickly retorts, to impose circumcision on Titus is to deny salvation in faith alone. And it just erupts into these people talking over one another, and it's getting loud. Finally, Peter says, "Stop, be quiet." And he asks everyone to leave the room except your small delegation, James, Peter, and that's probably it, maybe one or two others. And then the conversation can begin. Peter and James did agree with Paul. There is no doubt about that. That's very important for us as 21st century Christians, really, to understand that they did side with Paul. That is also how they had come to understand the gospel message. However, James says this, and when we get to his gospel, we will really study this. He says, Paul, can't just practice with me for just a minute, pretend. James, the brother of Jesus, says, Paul, I understand that it is grace in faith alone, and I get that, but works has its place. We cannot deny that works has its place because freedom in Christ doesn't give us license to sin. It's not just believing in God and then living your life as you always have before. There is a change. There is a change in being a new creation, and then works follow your belief. Works follow faith. Works do not save us, but works are a natural outcome of faith in Jesus. And Paul says, I'll go with that. I'll go with that. It's a natural outpouring. And that's how we understand what the full gospel is. There's a really good book that I have recently become aware of. It's called The Hole in the Gospel by Richard Stearns. He's the CEO of World Vision. And he talks about that in our 21st century life and practice of Christianity today, that there's a hole in the gospel. I would say that if we were at the Jerusalem Council, Peter and James and Paul would probably have agreed with Richard Stearns as well. Well, you might say, well, what's the hole in the gospel? Well, that's a great question. The hole in the gospel is that we Christians today get the belief part, but we don't always get the works part that are naturally supposed to flow out of faith. All throughout the Bible, it talks about helping the poor, fighting injustices, caring for orphans, caring for widows, and that is the part that American Christians have forgotten. It's a wonderful read. You really maybe would want to consider it as a Christmas present this year for yourself or for others. It really helps you to understand what the hole in the gospel is today. The reason I say that if we were at the Jerusalem Council, they would probably agree that this would make a hole in the gospel is because of what James and Peter say before they let Paul and Paul's delegation go back home. They left them with a blessing. Titus does not have to be circumcised to be saved. We give you that one. But go and continue to give generously to the poor. And that is something that I don't want you to miss because it was not only all throughout the Old Testament. If you missed it there, you would have heard it in Jesus' teachings. And if you missed it there, you would see it yet again at this very important meeting in Jerusalem called the Jerusalem Council, where they are establishing and reaffirming. It had been established. They're reaffirming yet again how important it is to give generously to the poor and become active in helping those in need around us. This is a call to us today, and as it was a call to them as well. Now, Peter and James also said that there were 4 things. Circumcision wasn't one of them, but there were 4 things that Paul needed to preach and encourage the Gentile believers to do. Do you remember what they were? Do not eat food offered to idols. Keep your body pure, so no sexual immorality. Do not eat meat that comes from a strangled animal, and do not consume blood of an animal that had been killed. My question is, how did they come up with those 4 things? Well, the answer is very simple. They didn't pull them out of the air. They didn't all of a sudden get revelation in the meeting. They used the Mosaic Law to determine what was appropriate. That can be found back in Leviticus 17 and 18. It was part of the law that God gave to Moses, and there was a provision in there for foreigners who live among you, Israelites. These are the things that the foreigners must do, behave, act like, if they are to live peaceably among you. These were the 4 things that Peter and James took right from the Mosaic Law and told Paul that this was what the Gentiles need to do. I believe that these 4 things still apply to us as Gentile Christians today and relate to us today in the 21st century. So, back to pretending again. This would have been the discussion. It would have been an amicable discussion. You would have been pleased that you would come. You would have been pleased of the outcome. Titus is thrilled because he doesn't have to be circumcised. And you all get to head home now, and you leave with a letter. And this letter is a letter of encouragement written by, let's see, I know James was part of the writing. I'm wondering if Peter was too. I think they were. And they just wrote this letter of encouragement back to, Paul would have taken it back to the churches, and it would have confirmed that Paul's stance was more correct than the stance of the Judaizers. So, one more thing I want to share with you that I wonder if you might have had a question about, and that was during Paul's second missionary journey. There was a boy that he meets, Timothy. His mother and grandmother Eunice are very famous among women's circles because this is a godly boy that had been raised in a godly home by a godly grandmother. And Paul is just delighted with Timothy. Wants him to be Mark's replacement because Mark had separated from Paul a while back. So now Timothy is a disciple, if you will, of Paul, and they're traveling together. There was an issue of whether or not he needed to be circumcised. This is questionable because haven't we been through this already? Well, no, the situation here is very different. Let me explain. This time, they were trying to decide should Timothy be circumcised. Not because they thought that it was required to be saved. They were past all that. But this time they were, instead of acting out the letter of the law, which would have been that, they were acting out the spirit of the law. Have you ever thought about the difference? Well, here's a perfect example. The letter of the law would have said, you have to be circumcised to be saved. Timothy, let's go. But the spirit of the law would have said, let's think about what Jesus taught when Jesus said, don't do anything that might cause your brother to stumble. So Paul and Timothy probably sat there and thought, we're going to go visiting some Jewish people that are that feel very strongly about this. And Timothy, they're going to be very uncomfortable if you're in their home and in their midst and you're an uncircumcised Gentile. This might be a stumbling block for them. Do you think if we did this and you were circumcised, that they might be more open to welcoming us in and more open to hearing the message from the Lord? Do you see the difference? Not letter of the law, but spirit of the law. This was why Timothy became circumcised, so that they wouldn't cause their fellow brothers to stumble. Small but distinct difference there. So, that's all for today. Tomorrow we're going to continue in, actually we're going to start something new tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to start another one of Paul's letters, 1 Thessalonians, and it will kind of give us something new to talk about as we start his second letter to the churches. I hope you'll join me. Thanks so much for being with me today. Blessings to you and your family. Shalom.